Hi there, my name is Vicki Nishioka, and I want to welcome you to this presentation. I am so excited to speak at the Oregon Response to Instruction and Intervention Conference because I know the dedicated school and district teams that attend. I also get to talk about three of my favorite subjects, that being equity, school climate, and social and emotional learning. This session is sponsored by REL Northwest at Education Northwest, and it's titled, "What is social and emotional learning, and what does it have to do with response to intervention?" REL Northwest is one of 10 regional educational laboratories across the United States. We serve Montana, Idaho, Washington, Alaska, and of course, Oregon. The goal of the REL program is to help states and districts use data to address important policy issues, as well as to improve educational practices. We provide these services to local stakeholders, local stakeholders through research alliances like the Equity in School Discipline Collaborative. This collaborative includes committed people from state education agencies, districts, as well as community providers that are really interested in equity and school discipline from Oregon and Washington. They have been pretty essential in this work. They've helped us to identify the priorities in their states. They've helped us to understand how we could help them use data and evidence to move and improve their discipline practices. And they help us to review our materials so that they can be more user-friendly for districts and school teams like yourself. REL Northwest supports schools and districts' capacity to incorporate data and research into everyday decision-making. We also deliver customized trainings like the presentation you are viewing today, as well as extended coaching and technical support on issues that are priorities for our districts and school partners. We build capacity, we help districts build capacity on data system development, and we conduct research. In the last 2 months, we've released 2 research studies examining how exclusionary discipline practices such as suspensions and expulsions have changed after enactment and implementation of Oregon school discipline policy reforms. All of the resources that we've developed, as well as the study findings, can be found at the REL Northwest website. But also feel free to reach out to me, and I would be very happy to answer any questions or explain a little bit more about REL services themselves. Today, we're talking about what is social and emotional learning. We're also going to explore what the research says about why culturally responsive SEL is important. And we're going to talk about how we can strengthen adult capacity in teaching SEL and using culturally responsive strategies. I smile every time I look at this picture. I think it's adorable, and we're hoping that during this presentation, you will be able to have a smile or two, and also increase or share your insights and knowledge about your settings and how social and emotional learning could improve outcomes for your students. So let's talk about what is social and emotional learning. There are several definitions of social and emotional learning, commonly referred to as SEL, but the one developed by the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning is the most widely used. In 2020, Castle updated the definition of SEL, and it is on the screen before you. So let me walk through this and read this definition to you. And as we read it, think about how SEL might be relevant to your setting and in terms of looking at it through this lens, or how it might advance some of the goals that you have for increasing equity and increasing the diversity and the cultural responsiveness of your school climate. Social and emotional learning is an integral part of education and human development. SEL is the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsive and caring decisions. Wow. SEL does a lot. And this is not to say that we're not always learning social and emotional learning skills. We are. We start learning those skills at birth and we continue, and it's a lifelong process. But how we're going to think about SEL today is if we, so school and district teams begin to intentionally teach certain SEL skills to students as rigorously as academic skills, will it improve school climate? Will it help them maintain and support positive relationships with peers as well as teachers? Will it help students from culturally diverse, racially diverse, and language diverse backgrounds feel accepted, feel more a part of the school community? And will it make will it better prepare students for success in school as well as transition to the college or career of their choice? Iceberg and Cascarino in 2013 really began to describe 5 core competencies that students should learn and practice. And actually, these 5 core competencies are things that adults should learn how to teach, coach, and model for students. So let's walk through these and unpack them a little bit in terms of their definition and their application. The first one is self-awareness. And that refers to the ability to recognize your own emotions, emotional patterns, such as what are some things that may make you upset, and then what are the behavioral choices that you make in terms of when you become upset or angry, disappointed, or frustrated. It also refers to the ability to know how to generate and use emotions such as enthusiasm, excitement, and joy to motivate your learning as well as the learning of your students. People who have some self-awareness about their SEL skills usually have a realistic understanding of their capabilities and recognize their emotional strengths as well as areas for growth. Self-management, and we talk about this as emotional regulation, really refers to the ability to, to regulate your emotions, reactions, and behaviors in different situations. It also refers to the ability to set and work toward personal and academic goals. Social awareness, and this will resonate a lot for you as we begin to walk through this, and it will touch on this a great deal during the presentation, but social awareness refers to your ability to understand how you express emotions and how you express emotions affects your interactions with others. These skills help students and adults build strong and positive relationships with others through cooperation, showing empathy, and resolving conflicts through effectively, and also preventing or repairing harm that might have been done. People who have social awareness are also sensitive to the important role that culture has on learning and building relationships, and they use social perspective taking to learn about the perspectives and lived experiences of others. So they really begin to think about not only what is happening to them and how it impacts themselves, they are really actively seeking to learn more and be aware of and consider how situations may be perceived or experienced by other people. Responsible decision-making really relates to the ability to make decisions that are respectful and constructive. It means basing one's decisions on a set of ethical standards or values. It really requires the ability to assess events to accurately and to really understand how your perspectives may influence your behavioral choices in response to those events, and also understand how other people's perspectives may be different from your own and influence their behaviors as well. Responsible decision-making also should include the making decisions and understanding the decisions that you make and how they might affect the well-being of yourself as well as other people. So responsible decision-making is that whole problem-solving process and the ability to analyze data from your perspective, from other people's perspective, and come up with solutions that are respectful to yourself and others, and also gets the problem solved. Relationship skills refers to the ability to establish and maintain healthy relationships with individuals from diverse backgrounds by valuing their perspectives emphasizing respectful interactions from their point of view and resolving conflicts through problem solving. It also includes the ability to ask for or provide help when needed. So those are the 5 core competencies that really guide research and practices and will become the foundation of this presentation. Our goal is to create school communities in which students and adults can learn and thrive. And what we know is social and emotional learning skills can help you create school climates that are welcoming, caring, safe, and build positive relationships. I'm going to walk through some features or some characteristics of caring learning communities that promote equity. In my view, and emerging thought through the literature and among districts and across the U.S. is that we need to move beyond just being tolerant of differences in culture, in race, in language, and other self-identified cultural identities, and move towards really seeing differences as a valuable asset to a learning community, that we should build learning communities that welcome and affirm each person's racial and cultural identities, and know that diversity will help to enrich our learning of both adults and students, and really begin to create opportunities for them to learn how to communicate and reach across difference, so they can build relationships with others who come from different cultural backgrounds than their own. That is a very important skill, especially as we move more into the 21st century and an interdependent world. It's skills that will really promote success for students in their school career, but also, as we said earlier, as they transition to their post-secondary education or career of their choice. We also want to think that learning communities that focus on equity integrate SEL throughout the school day. Teachers are teaching it, modeling and coaching students to use SEL skills, and the skills that they're teaching really underlies the importance of respecting and valuing differences, and it reflects the communication styles, the values, and the cultural traditions of the local community or the students and families within that school community. So we're really beginning to integrate SEL, but that SEL really does represent the culture of the students and families that you are supporting in your work. Caring learning communities really make sure that students are physically, socially, and emotionally safe. They really make sure that they have a bully-free climate, and that students feel like they're included, that they feel like they have a sense of belonging, that they are respected, and that what they bring in terms of their individual cultural identities is important and valued and will be an asset to themselves and to the learning community. The last thing is caring learning communities really seek to strengthen and do this continuously, strengthen relationships among adults, the youth, and families within that community. That really, we are talking about building learning communities that have strong and positive relationships, in which people can communicate and build friendships, but also they can really communicate and problem solve and work through differences in opinion and conflicts, and they really celebrate racial and cultural differences as assets to their own learning and their growth as an individual. For this presentation, we're going to focus mostly on building adult capacity on teaching, modeling, and coaching SEL skills that can be used to engage each and every student across all tiers of a response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of support framework. That means that we're going to talk about some general strategies that you can use at the bottom tier or with students as they move up into the middle or top tiers based on their need for academic, behavioral, or social support. So we're really going to talk in more general terms about culturally responsive practices. We're really not going to move into and talk about how to select social and emotional learning programs at the universal prevention level, but certainly reach out to me if you have questions for that, because I can share some information about resources where you can go to learn more about available resources and the resource that support that speaks to their effectiveness and to students overall, and also to students from different racial and cultural backgrounds. So why is culturally responsive SEL important? As with most new programs, successful implementation requires buy-in and support from administration and staff. A strategy that helps with this approach is telling staff how and why SEL will promote student success. I think that when we talk to teachers about teaching social and emotional learning, I think the immediate response is, from some teachers, is that they haven't had a lot of training, they haven't had a lot of experience in doing that, and they are concerned about their ability to really do it well. That they really don't have understand what the definition is, they don't understand how to approach it, and they worry that if they take time to teach SEL, it will take time away from their academic instruction time, and therefore may hinder their ability to promote student success academically. Well, SEL has become a focus and a priority in education because of the significant benefit that research has shown for students and educators. Simply put, students who receive SEL instruction have better outcomes. A recent examination of 4 meta-analyses that really looked at many research programs that had a fair amount of rigor, found that positive short and long-term outcomes for students from kindergarten through grade 12 who had received SEL instruction during their schooling. Mahoney and his colleagues really began to look at this and found that in their review that students had on average 11 percentage point gain in academic achievement, that students also had better social and emotional learning skills. They were better able to apply that in the school setting. They had more positive attitudes about themselves and about school. They also brought more positive behaviors in the classroom and also in non-academic settings, which is always welcome news to teachers. And they did better academically. Another benefit of SEL was that it lowered the emotional distress and stress levels of students and decreased the behavioral issues that arose in classrooms. So I think overall, there has been a number of studies that have really documented that SEL is associated with positive outcomes for students. We also know that SEL has positive outcomes, teaching SEL has positive outcomes for adults. Adults who are aware of their own social and emotional learning and teach and model and coach those skills tend to have, like their job better, tend to have lower stress levels, tend to do better in managing classroom behaviors, and really have better relationships with their students. A sense of belonging is defined as the extent to which students feel personally accepted, respected, included, and supported by others in the school's social environment. This becomes important because having a sense of belonging is associated with students who have better motivation, have higher self-esteem, really do better academically, and it's been known associated with reduced dropout rates. So one of the things that SEL can bring is developing and encouraging and building a sense of belonging or connection for students and their school. And we talked a little bit about this, but more specifically, culturally responsive SEL can promote a sense of belonging for all students. It improves teacher-student relationships, it improves their self-esteem, it improves their self-confidence and self-efficacy, also improves their motivation to learn and in turn their attendance and academic success. Given the many benefits that SEL instruction has for students and adults, I thought it might be interesting to learn what current high school students and past high school students thought about SEL in their school. Students were given a survey about cell instruction that they received in high school. And what we see is over 60% of all students, and almost up to 3/4 or 2/3 and 3/4 of the current and high school students reported that they had better student relationships. 2/3 or higher reported that their relationships with friends and other students had improved. Almost 2/3 said that learning about cell in high school reduced bullying, both for themselves when they were in high school, but also the current or past high school graduates. And then 69% of the current high school students said that it helped their academic learning, and 64% of high school graduates said that it also help their academic learning. So what we know is not only does the research say that cell helps, but students who are experiencing cell report that and recognize that it really has helped their relationships, helped their ability to get along with teachers, and help them to learn and reach higher academic goals. Let's take some time to think about cell, and I am very disappointed that you're not here in person, but let's go ahead and do this chat blast activity. And this means that what I want you to do is think about what you've learned in this training and what you know about cell, and please answer the questions below in your chat box, and wait until I say send before sharing. So the first question is this: what are ways that you or your colleagues help all students feel personally accepted, respected, and included in your setting? Okay, you can either say it or think it or send it in your chat. If you're like most people, what they say is greeting students by their name, not by a nickname. I think some students of color often complain about teachers who can't pronounce their name if it's in a different language or related to a different culture, and instead they make up nicknames that they call the students instead, or they shorten their name in ways without really asking the students permission, and so students feel very disrespected by that. Other things that students have said is that if teachers would reach out and talk to them individually during class instead of only talking at the whole group, if they took a moment and came and asked them, and talked to them, especially asking them a question about their background. Some teachers have suggested that they like to ask students about their hobbies. They'd like to ask students about their brothers and sisters or the sports that they like to do, anything to really get to know them. And you can do this in just less than a minute in the classroom setting as you're navigating, rotating among students who might be working at their desks. So there's ways of doing that is important. I did a focus group with high school students, and they complained about teachers not reaching out and getting to know them as individuals. And when I asked them about high teacher-student ratios in their classes, and then this particular high school, they were pretty high. Someone had over 40 students to one teacher, and the students said that wasn't a reason that it couldn't happen. That they said even teachers who had high numbers of students in their classrooms found time to greet them, found times to ask them a question or to reach out to them individually. It may not be every day, but at some point across the week, they really felt like the teacher tried to make a personal connection to them. So the students said, no, that wasn't an issue, that some teachers just really valued that as a communication and building relationships with students, and other teachers did not. So those are some things that I've heard teachers and students say about this. Second question. Who are the students that may not feel supported in their school or learning environment? I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. Okay, so either press send, or let's see what you had in your thinking. When I asked this of teachers, all of them say, although they try to make sure that all students feel like they are supported in their school or classroom, that it tends to be students of color, especially Black students, American Indian, Latinx, or students who may be coming from new refugees or immigrant status, or from neighborhoods that have or that are socially disadvantaged, or student groups that really have experienced on a daily basis disrespect around race, around culture, or around language. So I think that we can also look at students who have different sexual orientation than the dominant culture, students who speak different language, students with disabilities. So what we know is students who talk, act, or look different than the dominant culture in a school may be vulnerable to really feeling like they're not supporting, feeling bias, whether it's very egregious or overt bias and unfortunate incidents, or it's implicit bias where it's disrespect, but that is maybe more subtle and maybe not as recognized by the person who is doing it, but certainly felt as disrespect by the students that are experiencing it. When we talk about what is implicit bias and what are some disrespectful behaviors that we need to change and how we talk and communicate and act towards students, it's really not our opinion of what's okay. It's the opinion of the students who experience it. If they really believe it's disrespectful, then we need to hear that, and we need to find out what are ways that we can improve and connect with the students in ways that they really believe are respectful, that support them, and that are positive and really affirm their culture. So that begs the question of how can we strengthen adult capacity in SEL and culturally responsive strategies? What we know is that teachers need to know about their own SEL capacity. They also need to know how to teach SEL to students and model SEL to students throughout the school day. Boy, my computer is really on a roll here. It did it by itself. So let's talk a little bit about knowing yourself. Adults who really are skilled at teaching, modeling, and coaching SEL to their students know that how their own perspectives really influence the decisions that they make, influences their thinking, influences how they might interpret student behavior, and really influence the decisions that they make in terms of instruction or maybe classroom discipline. Caring teachers also show genuine interest in students as individuals, that they really like them and that they really go out of their way to let students know that they really do care for them as individuals, and they're interested in learning from them, learning about their culture, learning about their interests, learning about things that they like, and learning about how they believe the teacher can better support them in their classroom or in the school. Caring teachers also have high expectations for each student, that they really expect students to learn, and they also tell them that the students that they really believe that they can meet those high expectations and they can believe that they can get there. So having high expectations for each student. I think there's a tendency sometimes if students are navigating difficult life challenges to lower expectations for them, and then maybe do respond to them with sympathy versus empathy. And the problem with that is if we lower expectations for students, then we lower we may be communicating to students that we don't think that they can learn as well. We may not be preparing them for being academically successful in currently or in future grades. And so what we really want to do is have an empathetic response to students and ask how we can help. And instead of lowering expectations, we began to provide supports to them so that they can meet those expectations, but have extra supports to do so. And that could be providing extra help. It could be extending or softening some of the timelines or the dates that things are due, providing extra spaces that are safe for students work in. So there's a lot of different ways to begin to support student learning who are having difficulties, rather than just lowering expectations for them so that they can get by. A fourth way is of showing that you care about students is you identify and intervene early if students have social, emotional, or academic difficulties. And this kind of relates to high expectations, that if a student begins to struggle, then you do something early before that student has a chance to fail. And that could be sitting down and talking to them. It could be figuring out what is it that they need in terms of more academic instruction, or do they need some more social support? Does it mean that you should conference with the parents to see what you can do together to support the student? But the big point of this is that if you see a student struggle, that you intervene early before they experience failure. The last feature is that you set up opportunities for students to practice SEL skills throughout the school day, that you begin to look for and reward and coach and recognize when students use the SEL skills that you want to promote so that they are reinforced. I think the really exciting thing about teaching social and emotional learning is you can teach something in the classroom, and then you can provide opportunities for students to practice it in real life social situations. But to be able to learn from that, it's important that adults model the SEL skills, and it's important that they provide coaching and feedback to students on how they're using the SEL skills, whether it's they're using them well, recognizing that, or providing feedback that will improve their ability to apply it in the future. I think when we talk about culture, it's pretty overwhelming because culture is so complex. It's multi-layered, and it really encompasses the attitudes, beliefs, values, traditions, and customs. And some of these are visible, but many, and the majority, are not readily visible. I like this cultural iceberg picture because it was developed by students in Canada, and I think it really is a wonderful, simple graphic of the cultural iceberg. As you can see, we can see people and represented in how people dress and how they look, and the language that they speak, and the behaviors that they engage in terms of traditions, and like the foods that they eat, like the holidays that they experience, and some of the traditions that they have. What's less visible are things like their talents, or their musical preferences, or the family traditions that they might have. And what's even less visible is the life experience that they may have had before they came to your school, the values that are really important to their family, and what they are, what the personal beliefs that they have, and the assumptions that they have about school. So I think culture really encompasses all of that, both visible and less visible characteristics of a person. So it's pretty overwhelming when we talk about how can we be respectful to everybody's culture and really reach across difference in our communication and our building relationships, and in our strengthening a culturally affirming environment in our school. Well, one way to do that is not to expect that you will know everything. That is really beginning to engage in perspective-taking skills, where you actively seek out information, or actively seek out and reach out to students and to colleagues to ask them about their cultural background, to ask them about some of their thoughts and beliefs, to ask them about their preferences, so that you learn more about them. And so it really becomes a part of your school culture that everybody is going to learn from each other. The adults and students are going to learn about each other, and they will seek out opportunities to learn about cultural differences. These skills will be absolutely helpful as they move on into their more diverse settings, and will be an asset as they move on into advanced classes, but also as they move into the college and career choice as they become adults. Unlike race or gender, culture is not a definable entity to which people belong or do not belong. Within a race, community, or program, individuals belong to multiple cultural groups and navigate multiple cultural expectations every day. I'm a Japanese woman and I'm influenced by Japanese traditions from my family. I'm also influenced by some of the attitudes that they have about women versus men. I'm also influenced by the general attitudes of women versus men in the overall culture. So I'm influenced by the sports that I used to be involved in, the clubs I used to be involved in, the social activities that I do with other people. So culture is although it is, we see traditions across groups of people, it's also a very individual, based on your preferences, based on your life experiences, based on how you choose to build the values that guide your decisions and your life decisions. Because culture is influenced and expressed in many ways, it embraces characteristics that are not visible. And so it really requires us to really think about the social and emotional learning skills of perspective taking, building empathy, and building relationships that sustain across time. We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are, is a famous quote by Anais Nin. And I use that a lot because what it really means is when I experience something, when I view an event, when I hear something, my interpretation and the meaning that I derive from that is really filtered through my beliefs, my cultural backgrounds, my experiences. And so my perspective of what happened and interpretation of what happened could be very different from somebody else who has a different lived experience, who has a different way of thinking about the world, who has really different cultural values and assumptions and beliefs. And so really beginning to understand that perspectives of one thing can be very varied is an important first step of culturally responsive practices. And so as we begin to think about that, we're going to explore what are different ways that students may be viewing how you're managing your classroom, what are different ways that students may be hearing what you're saying to them, and how can you begin to reach across difference so you begin to have a common understanding of the social norms in your classroom, of the expectations that you have, and also of how you're going to explore or discuss differences in a way that's culturally respectful, but yet really begins to resolve problems that arise. Bird conducted a study to learn more about student perceptions of classrooms that vary in the amount of culturally relevant practices. And I think that what we know from this study and others is that she found significant associations between using culturally relevant teaching and the academic outcomes for different racial, ethnic, and cultural groups. And I don't think that that's something that's a surprise. But what it means is one intervention that she really looked at was a social and emotional learning intervention that was intended to decrease depression, helplessness, and negative thinking among students. Well, what they found was when that was applied in the classroom, that particular curriculum worked very well with Latinx children, but it really had no effects on students who were Black. So really thinking about, is this curriculum that we're teaching culturally responsive? Has it been shown to be culturally effective with different cultural or racial groups? And if not, what are some adaptations that you might have to make sure that it really does connect and resonate with the students that you're teaching? As we said before, our cultural background influences how we communicate, how we interpret situations, and the behavioral choices we choose. Cultural differences can lead to misunderstandings and unnecessary discipline situations that may include removing a student from classroom instruction. So it really is something that we have talked a great deal about in the Equity in School Discipline Collaborative. So one thing I would like you to think about is, what role do you think cultural misunderstandings play in discipline situations involving disrespect? We believe that a lack of knowledge about another person's cultural values, norms, styles, and language may lead to miscommunication. Let me give you an example. a teacher was asked students to work on their own to complete an assignment, and she got really upset when a group of students who were English learners and who had came from a cultural background of Latinx, where their families valued really that working together to reach a certain outcome, and they were used to learning by talking with each other and trying to figure out problems and getting the work done as a group. Well, she interpreted their talking together as disrespectful of her instruction to do the work, because her idea of finishing the work was students sitting down and doing the work by themselves independently. And so there was a very real cultural clash, and students were sent to the office because she felt like they were not following directions and that they were being disruptive. And really what was happening, it was just a cultural misunderstanding. Cultural misunderstandings can be caused by words, differences, a gesture, an object, or social context that has different meanings in two cultures. You know, one of the things that I remember is we were talking about this to a very large group of educators. We had over 100 people in the audience, and I had a teacher that raised his hand and said, I want to share something because I have really blown it. And so I asked him to explain more. And he said that he had been working on a short-term contract in the classroom that he hadn't been in, and things were not going that well. Students didn't seem to be motivated, and he wasn't sure what to do about that. And this was an elementary classroom, and he had a student that came up to him and said, Mr. So-and-so, I just need to tell you something, that everything that you're doing in our classroom really is not right. It isn't how we do things here. And so he just said, I really blew it. And then the student told him and gave him suggestions about things that he could change. And he really felt like, and he implemented those suggestions, and they really did improve his classroom functioning and his classroom management and his relationships with students. Well, he saw that as a complete failure. I saw that as a really great win. It might have been better to have asked that at the beginning, but at least the student who was in elementary school felt like he had enough of a positive relationship with the teacher and really did trust that the teacher would be good stewards of his advice about how to change the classroom and would listen. So I think that is what we're really looking for. How do we create environments where students can talk about their cultural background, can share their preferences in terms of doing their work, in terms of communication, and feel like it can be heard, and they can talk it out and reach a decision or a mutually agreeable solution to whatever dilemma that arises. So I think we are not talking about you as adults figuring out how to make your schools culturally respectful to all cultures. We're talking about building a school climate where the value is on understanding cultural differences and really learning from each other about that, so that we can be better about reaching across difference and make sure that we maintain strong relationships as we do that. We think that perspective taking and empathy are important tools to get this done. And so, and they can really help determine or prevent cultural misunderstandings, and then in turn really reduce discipline problems. Here we have another chat blast. So here, in your opinion or experience, what are some cultural misunderstandings that have or could have occurred in your school or setting? And if you don't know, how would you find out? So some of the information that has been shared by others who have answered this questions is that they really talk to teachers. They ask teachers about that, but more importantly, they talk to families and students, that the families and students are the ones who can help teachers understand the culture and values of students who come from different cultural backgrounds than their own, and can be a great resource of information. They also can look at and begin to note some of the issues that arise in classrooms and some of the solutions that can come up that student success suggests could be solutions to those problems. One middle school began to set up a process where if there was a problem in the classroom, the student was getting frustrated and the teacher was getting frustrated, that the student could go to what they call a reflection room, and where there was a staff person there that was that could help them kind of think through what was the problem and do a problem solving process with them so that they could prepare them to go back into the classroom setting. This was meant to be as an intervention before going to in-school suspension and going down to the office as a formal office discipline referral. It was meant to give the students some practice in calming themselves down and removing themselves from a situation that they were having difficulty with, and then using a problem-solving process to think through what they could have done differently. And the part of the process was writing that out. Well, it did reduce the number of office discipline referrals, and students were able to step out of the classroom and come back in and re-enter and do very well. And then one of the things they found too was there was a great deal of value in the problem-solving worksheets, because they got a better understanding of the cultural misunderstandings, of the situations that were happening in the classroom that they could prevent by just doing something differently or talking to the students or approaching the students in a different way. So really thinking about adding that dimension of getting the student's perspective, getting the students' solutions, and documenting that to see if you can look at patterns in your school about cultural misunderstandings that are happening that may be contributing to increased discipline issues. Next question. What can adults do to promote positive relationships with students from cultural backgrounds different than their own? I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. I hope some of you said that adults really need to examine and be very aware of how their bias and their thinking around students from different cultural or racial backgrounds may be influencing their decisions or how they interpret the students' behavior. And so being very self-aware of what you're thinking and the bias that might be influencing your decisions is really, really important. The second thing is just reaching out and being intentional and finding out more about the students' cultural backgrounds, more about what the students like, what their traditions are, what their way of thinking is about different parts, and really engaging them in a way where the students believe that your intent is to learn, and that it really does model that a learning community where adults and students and everybody in the learning community works and learns together. The other thing is really beginning to recognize students and in culturally appropriate ways, and understanding that when students are the influences that culture might have and how you are rewarding students. I just remember talking to some parents, and one of them mentioned that her son came home and was very hurt, had hurt feelings one day, and what he talked about was the school gave out group rewards, and that students would earn tickets as part of a PBIS process, and that would go into a jar, and they would pull out the ticket and reward a student as part of a lottery. And he felt very hurt because that was so different than their culture, which really looked at not just individual students being rewarded, but that rewards happen for the whole community. So he really felt left out and didn't really understand how that worked, because it was so different from the values and the ways that he had been brought up, or that successes were celebrated in his family and his community outside of school. So thinking about how culture really influences how people and students might view how you're giving feedback, both positive and corrective feedback about skills, is really an important thing to think about and ask about with your students and families. Let's talk about culture responsive cell instruction. And first of all, to do that, let's talk a little bit about culture. Really thinking about culture and thinking about the iceberg, it becomes overwhelming at how complex and individualized it is. So Hofstede spent some time researching and looking at what are dimensions of culture that we should pay attention to and that really influence student outcomes or outcomes for adults at work or outcomes for adults just in their daily life. And he came up with 6, and they are here. Individualism versus collectivism, high versus low power distance, high versus low uncertainty avoidance, masculinity versus femininity, which is something that we talk a lot about in our culture. So I think that might be very familiar to you. The difference between really working towards long-term outcomes or really having a more short-term orientation in terms of time, and indulgence versus restraint. And so what we're going to talk about mostly today is related to individualism versus collectivism and high versus low power distance. This shows up a lot in schools, and the research shows that these 2 dimensions really influence the sense of belonging that students have and also the academic outcomes that some student groups may achieve. Cultural misunderstandings related to individualism versus collectivism may create barriers to adults in relation to positive relationships between adults and youth. Individualism is what I kind of think about when I think about white dominant culture in most schools, is that it really focuses on the well-being of the individual, that the traits such as independence and self-reliance are highly valued with the goal of gaining knowledge or cognitive intelligence for that person. Sales skills that students use in individualist cultures are self-expression, self-advocacy, self-esteem, and really being task-oriented to achieve a task on your own. So those are kind of the social emotional skills and the values that are generally associated with individualism. Now, in complete contrast to that is collectivism. In collectivist cultures, they reflect the values of many youth and families that come from diverse backgrounds and that may be in your school. And they really focus on the well-being of the group. Interdependence and cooperation are highly valued, that it's not just one person succeeding, it's everybody succeeding. So social intelligence and really beginning to maintain strong relationships are highly valued. And being able to enter into and being respectful of other people, being very modest, being showing humility, and really understanding and having social awareness are important social emotional learning skills in collectivist groups. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what this might mean from the point of view of parents of color, and this recently I was able to listen to parents of color of elementary students and their concerns about culture and how individualism and collectivism were being experienced by their students. They were first very concerned that their children were beginning to come home and say it was better to have individualism kinds of values rather than the collectivism values of their family and their community, that really the goal was to become more individual and driven for yourself, and that working for the group as part of a group goal or the well-being of a group was really less of a value and less important and less respected. The other thing that teachers, the parents were very concerned about were teachers coming to them and telling them during conferences that they were concerned and that their student had to work on being less modest, being less humble, being less quiet, that they really needed to begin to talk out more. They needed to be able to advocate more, and they needed to really begin to self-promote themselves in ways that that the other students were doing. And so they were all then concerned that the values and the traits that they respected and valued in their children were not being respected and valued by the teachers in the school. So that's a clear example of some of the conflicts. And if you think about that happening in elementary school and moving on with students into middle and high school, that can create a real disconnect in terms of culture, in terms of really feeling like you are part of a school community. Many students that I talk to about who come from Latinx or other races really talk about feeling invisible in their school, that there isn't a lot of visibility about their culture, and the values that they want and the values that they think are important are not ways to get ahead in the school culture that they are currently in. Well, the principal heard that and went back to teachers and just explained, this is how the parents are viewing this. This is how they're viewing your suggestions about what students should work on. And at the next parent meeting, the parents came back with, boy, the teachers are really talking to us more about what we value. They really are. They didn't even, they're no longer talking about that we need to try to get our children to talk out more in class, that they're really beginning to understand the cultural value that we put on being respectful, being quiet, and being humble. So I think just really asking people about their cultures and then really acting on that feedback went a long way to building relationships within that school community. I'm going to give you an example from a research study. This was a case study of several schools, and this is one example of a teacher who went through and got training around culturally relevant practices. And so when she first started a classroom, and it was a classroom of predominantly Latinx students, she thought, well, I'm going to set up a star chart for each student, and every time that student learned a mathematical fact and multiplication, they would get a star. And she thought this chart would motivate students. They'd be really engaged, and they'd really want to see their star chart fill up, because she gave small rewards for completing a line or getting so many stars. Well, what happened was the students really didn't seem interested. And by the time she got ready to take the course, she'd actually put that chart into the closet and it was never used. That she just thought it didn't work, and students weren't really motivated to learn math. Well, when she went through the course, she went back and tried a different approach. She dragged out the chart and she looked at it with students, and she said, well, let's look at this chart together and let's talk about how we might use it. And the students said to her, well, wouldn't it be neat if it would be a solid block of stars and the whole chart was filled in, meaning that every student in the classroom really met all of their goals, and wouldn't that be great? And so the students who were coming from a cultural background that really valued collectivist approaches, and so they got really excited, and so that's what she did, and then problem solved. I think that when we talk about aligning our approaches for motivating students, for engaging students, we really need to think about the cultural values that they hold dear, because it really does speak to motivation, ways that we can motivate students and engage students in meaningful ways. Another chat blast activity. So what skills could students learn using an individualist approach? And what skills could students learn using a collectivist approach? As we said earlier, an individualist approach really values self-manage. It really values that self-advocacy and that self-direction, that ability to really seek out and ask for answers and really put your goals and your agenda as a priority in your work and the way that you really manage work tasks, as well as goals that you have. students in a collective approach, they really begin to build that social awareness of how do you look at the perspective of others? How do you include in your thinking and decision making the well-being of other people? That really the goal is not only to get the job done, but also to make sure that relationships are intact as you do that. And so it may be that getting the job done takes a little longer. It's a little messier, and it might be a little noisier because students will be talking to each other, but it really is an approach that fits better with some students' cultural values. Now, this doesn't mean that you should choose an individualist approach or a collectivist approach. It means that maybe students need to know both. But your school community needs to offer opportunities for students who may have a more collectiveness orientation to really navigate your school successfully and feel like the way they approach learning is respected and supported by your school environment. And so I think it's not about one or the other, it's about really including all of the cultural values that students have and seeing if you can build in ways that that students can get ahead based on their values and eliminate barriers that prevent students from not getting ahead in that way. I'm going to give you an example. I think I talked to just delightful groups of high school students about their school. And most of them said, well, we learn from teachers. And many said there was a group of students who really liked their school, who were really academically doing pretty well. They constantly reached out to their teachers, asked for help, made sure that the teachers met with them to give them instruction. They also were very competent in going through and getting information from websites and really asking for how to get into things, how to get into the clubs they wanted. So they were very much self-advocates of moving towards their own goals. There's another group of students that really didn't understand how to navigate that system. And in fact, they came from cultural backgrounds. And when they went to the classroom, they said their interpretation was that some teachers in their classrooms really asked them and told them it was okay to ask questions. Yet in other classrooms, the teachers did not let them know that it was okay to ask questions. The teacher was they came from a background where teachers were really respected. They set the ground rules from the class. They really believed in those classroom programs that questions were not welcome. Now, if I went to those teachers, they probably would be surprised by that information. But I think that the students in that setting and in that school really had difficulty navigating it. They didn't know how to get information. They didn't know how to join groups. They didn't know how to use an individualized kind of cultural system to really advance their goals. And they also had problems because it wasn't that they couldn't learn those skills. It was that using those skills really was in direct conflict with the values that they really held dear to themselves, and so it created a disconnect and some conflicts within themselves and a little bit of stress because they didn't feel like they belonged at that school. They didn't feel like their cultural values were valued, and so they really felt invisible in the classrooms and in the school setting. So really thinking about, do students really feel like they belong? Do students feel like their cultural values are being respected? Are important questions that you should ask yourself, and more importantly, you should ask students and families to make sure that you are accommodating groups of students as they move forward. School climate, I always think, is a little bit about, for me, housework or gardening, that it's work that you have to keep up and it never ends, that you're never done, that you can't just check it off your list and say, I'll never have to do housework or gardening or anything out in the yard again. It's something that you have to continually nurture and continually find out about, because the students that come to your school will not always have the same cultural background or orientation. So having that open line of communication is really, really critical. Let's talk a little bit now about high versus low power distance. and cultures where there is high power distance. That refers to cultures that are teacher-centered, that the teacher is the person who really manages the learning in that situation, that they create routines that the students and teachers must follow. They tend to have stricter discipline in the settings, and if students are doing well, it's usually credited to the teacher being a really good teacher. So in essence, the teacher is seen as the keeper of the knowledge, and that any student gains are really largely due to the teacher, not to the student, not to the culture, or not to the climate. In contrast to that are low power distance situations. And these are what we call student-centered. And student-centered cultures really value teacher-student relationships, that they really believe that there's a shared responsibility for learning among teachers and students. That doesn't mean that teachers shouldn't teach, but there's a learning community where teachers recognize that, that they can learn from students. And if teachers or if students are successful, it's credited to the powerful and positive relationship that the teachers and students have. So it's a very, very different type of culture. It's a very different type of school climate. An important outcome for a culturally responsive cell, whether it is virtual or in person, is to help youth believe and feel that they are an important part of that school community. It's, as you remember, we talked about this earlier, that students who have a strong sense of belonging in the school really do better. And also adults who feel like they have a sense of belonging or connection to the school also do better. I'm going to read to you. There was a study that was done. It was an international study done in 2017 by Cortina and colleagues. And it was it involved 31 countries. It involved middle school students, but almost 87,000 middle school students and over 3,000 schools. And what they were looking at is, what are the dimensions of power, low versus power cultures, and individualistic versus collectivist cultures in schools? How does that influence a student's sense of belonging? And they measured the student's sense of belonging using these 5 questions. I feel included in things. I make friends easily. I feel like I belong. Other students seem to like me. I do not feel lonely. So I think about these values a lot, and I really picture to students, and I just wonder, what would this student say about these values? And what would this student say about their lived experience in the school? Would they say yes to everything except feeling lonely? Or would they say, boy, I don't really feel like I'm included. I have a hard time making friends. I really don't feel like I belong here, and other students don't seem to like me. So I think really thinking about those in terms of a sense of belonging in those two terms helps me, and I hope helps you as you begin to think about it. So the student measured the student's sense of belonging, and this is what they found, is that school climates that had, or classroom instruction that integrated individualistic, more collectivist kinds of learning environments, students had better sense of belonging, had higher rates of sense of belonging, and really did better academically. But really the thing that made the biggest difference and the most significant difference were classrooms that had a low difference between the power relationship between teachers and students. That was the one that created the largest sense of, the strongest sense of belonging. Classrooms where the teacher really valued building a relationship with their students, that really included students in some of the decision making around routines, around expectations, and really some of that problem solving around problems that might arise or conflicts might arise. Really, the students who were in those classrooms really had a stronger sense of belonging and actually did better in school socially, academically, and behaviorally. So the last activity for today. Which culturally responsive strategies could reduce the power distance between adults and students in your school? So thinking about the culture of your school and how to align it with the preferences of the cultural backgrounds of the adults, the students and their families, how could you use these cultural responsive strategies to really reduce the power difference between the adults and students in school? And what cell skills will students learn when you use these strategies? I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. What other educators and actually students have talked to us about is adults who ask them and include them in and ask their opinion and then actually act on it was a very strong strategy for reducing the power distance. Adults who asked their perspectives or asked about them as individuals, that asked about their cultural backgrounds, was very, very helpful and to creating a sense of belonging for students. And also it modeled for students how to reach across difference and learn about and teach others about their culture and learn about the importance of learning about the perspectives and cultural backgrounds of other students or teachers themselves. And I remember this very clearly. I was doing a group with students who were adults, but I had one student who was 18. He said, way back when I was a student, and that was like 2 years prior. So I chuckled a little bit about that. I thought I knew everything. I thought that I knew the world, that everything was right. And I really believe that every teacher in the school was born with a silver spoon in their mouth, that they had perfect lives, that they had no problems, they had lots of money, that they were, and I know that I can hear that the teachers and educators out there are probably laughing at this, but they really believe that teachers really came from a very stress-free and privileged life. But he said when his teachers began to tell them not about their struggles in school, about a mistake that they made, or they began to model mistakes or began to tell them and share how they managed stressful situations, he realized that they were the difference between themselves and the teachers in the school were really very small, that they were more alike than different because they were beginning to talk about some shared experiences that they had. So really beginning to communicate and provide information about yourself and your cultural backgrounds and some of the ways that you have used social and emotional learning skills was very powerful for this student as well as many other students who have talked about that. And also really validates for students and gives examples about how they can use those skills in their settings. Another culturally responsive strategy that has been used by teachers and schools is really providing learning events or beginning to build goals around inclusion. I know that one school really set the stage. The principal said on day one that inclusion and respecting cultural differences is my number one priority. And they planned events with students on how to make that happen. And so throughout the year, they had all of these celebrations and successes of really learning about each other's cultures and really set aside to do that. They did it through pancake breakfast, they did it through challenges, they did it through a myriad of different low-cost activities that took a little bit of work, but then they also shared that work with students in their school. So I think there's many different ways to think about it, and I actually think there are more ways if you include families and students in your thinking and getting ideas about what could work in your school. That is the end of this presentation. We really wanted to talk to you about self and the definition and how important it is to student academic, behavioral, and social outcomes. We also wanted to talk about considerations for thinking about moving towards or building structures where students who come from a collectivist cultural background can feel included and can use the skills that they value to really advance and feel a part of the school. We also talked about the importance of really closing the power distance between adults and students in the school in terms of really building routines, building culture, and building social norms of how to communicate with each other. So this was the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, in terms of cultural responsive practices, but I hope that it was helpful for you to think through some of these experiences. And again, I would really urge you to take some time to talk to students, to talk to educators, to talk to families about these issues, to get ideas about what does this look like in your setting. Last of all, I want to thank you for coming. I want to also thank you for the incredible commitment and resourcefulness, and I know tireless dedication that you show to students. I think especially in this last year of COVID-19 that has been critical for students to have an anchor, to really have some connection with school, and to really feel like there was some routine in their life in this very chaotic environment. So I wish you luck and success in your important work. And I really thank you again for your commitment to the learning of your students and to their well-being. Thank you for coming.